Jesus died at 3 in the afternoon on a Friday. Most people know that part. What almost nobody gets told is what the Bible says happened in the minutes right after. Not one strange event. A whole run of them, one after another, written down plainly, and then skipped over in almost every sermon you will ever hear. Start with the clock, because the Bible is unusually specific here. Mark writes that darkness covered the land from the 6th hour to the 9th hour. In the way they counted time, that is noon until 3 in the afternoon. 3 full hours. And then, at the 9th hour, Jesus died. The place was called Golgotha. It sat just outside the city wall, right beside a main road on purpose. Rome did not execute people in private. The whole point was that everybody walking in and out of the city had to see it, and had to understand exactly who was in charge. And this was not an ordinary week. It was Passover. Jerusalem was packed. Historians think the city could swell to several times its normal size, so the road past that hill was crowded with pilgrims, traders, families, all of them arriving for the most important feast of the year. There was a crowd at the hill too. Roman soldiers doing a job they had done 100 times. Religious leaders who had pushed for this, onlookers, and standing back at a distance, a small group of women and one of his own followers. Then, at noon, the light went out. Not slowly the way evening comes on. At midday, with the sun at its highest point, darkness came over the whole land. Luke, who was a doctor and careful with details, says the sun stopped shining. People sometimes say this was an eclipse. It could not have been. Passover always falls at full moon, and a solar eclipse can only happen at new moon. They are opposite points of the cycle. Whatever put out that light, it was not the moon crossing in front of the sun, and it held for 3 hours. Think about what that does to a crowd. People who came to watch an execution as entertainment stood in the dark for an entire afternoon. The Gospel writers do not record anybody shouting during those hours. The mocking that filled the earlier part of the day simply stops. Then at the 9th hour he cried out. Matthew and Mark both record it, and both of them keep the original Aramaic before they translate it, which is the kind of thing writers do when they are repeating words somebody actually heard. And then he died. The wording matters. The Gospels do not say his life gave out, or that he finally lost his strength. John writes that he gave up his spirit. Luke says he committed it. The language all the way through is of a man handing something over, not a man having it taken. The first thing the Bible records after that moment did not happen at the hill at all. It happened about 1/3 of a mile away, inside the temple, behind a door that almost nobody was allowed through. Inside the temple hung a curtain. It separated the main hall from the innermost room, the Holy of Holies. That inner room was where God's presence was understood to rest. One man went in, once a year, on one day, and only after a long list of preparations. Jewish tradition describes that curtain as enormous, roughly 60 feet high and thick enough that it was not something a person could tear by hand, and heavy enough that moving it took a team. At the moment Jesus died, that curtain tore. Matthew and Mark both say it split in two from top to bottom, not from the floor up the way it would go if it had been cut or pulled, from the top, 60 feet in the air where no hand could reach. Whatever else that was, it was a statement. The one barrier that had kept people out of that room, for centuries, was opened from the top down. Not by a priest, not on a scheduled day. At 3 in the afternoon on an ordinary Friday, from the inside. Think about who was in that building when it happened. The temple would have been full. Passover was the busiest week of the year, and the afternoon sacrifice fell at exactly that hour. Priests were working, and in front of all of them, the curtain came apart. There is something else worth noticing. The Gospel writers report this calmly, in a single sentence, and move on. They do not build it up. They do not explain what it means. They write it the way you would write down a thing you had been told by someone who was standing there. And they had reason to be careful. A large number of priests later joined the early church. Acts says so directly. Those were men who had been inside that building. If the story about the curtain had been invented, they were the worst possible audience for it. The tearing of that curtain is the reason the letter to the Hebrews later says what it says, that there is now a new and living way opened up, that the way in is no longer closed. The writer treats it as something that already happened, not something hoped for. So that is the first thing. A curtain 60 feet high, torn from the top, At the exact moment, a man died on a hill outside the wall. But the ground had not finished moving yet. Matthew keeps going in the same sentence. The curtain tore, he writes, and the earth shook, and the rocks were split. He puts them together because they happened together. Earthquakes are not unusual in that part of the world. The Jordan Rift runs right through the region, and the ground there has moved throughout recorded history. What makes this one worth writing down is not that it happened. It is when it happened. There is a detail here that gets missed. Geologists studying sediment layers near the Dead Sea have found evidence of seismic activity in that era. It does not prove the account. Nothing about a single afternoon 2,000 years ago can be proved that way. But it does mean the setting is real. Whatever its size, the shaking reached the tombs. And that is where the account turns into something people genuinely do not know what to do with. Matthew writes that the tombs were opened. That is the phrase. The shaking broke them open. Given how those tombs were built, cut into soft limestone and closed with a heavy stone, that part is not hard to picture at all. But he does not stop at the tombs opening. He writes that many bodies of holy people who had died were raised, and then he adds a detail that most readers go straight past. They came out of the tombs after his resurrection and went into the city and appeared to many people. Read that again. Not on the Friday, after his resurrection. Matthew mentions the tombs opening on the Friday, then jumps forward 3 days to say what came of it. It is the most startling sentence in the whole passage, and he gives it half a verse. People have argued about that verse for centuries. Some read it plainly. Some read it as the kind of writing that signals meaning rather than reporting events. What is not in question is that Matthew wrote it, early, in a city where people could still check. And that is a point worth holding on to through this whole account. These documents were written and circulated within living memory. Jerusalem was not a large city. The people named in these stories had families, neighbors, and enemies who were still alive. So the ground moved, the rocks split, and the tombs came open. Meanwhile, back at the hill, somebody had been standing close enough to watch the whole thing from the beginning. And what he said next is, in its own way, the strangest part of all. There was a Roman officer in charge at the hill, a centurion. The rank meant he commanded around 80 men, and he had earned it by surviving long enough to be trusted with them. Crucifixion was routine work for men like him. Rome used it for slaves, for rebels, for anyone it wanted to make an example of. A centurion posted in Judea would have overseen it many times. He was not a man who would be moved by a difficult afternoon. But Mark writes that this man was standing right in front of the cross, close, facing it. He watched the whole thing, through the darkness, through the cry, through the moment of death. And when it was over, he said something a Roman officer had no business saying. Truly, this man was the Son of God. Luke records it slightly differently. Certainly, this was a righteous man. Either way, it came from the one person there who was paid to feel nothing. Think about what that phrase meant in his world. Son of God was not a religious idea to a Roman soldier. It was a title on coins. It belonged to Caesar. Saying it about a condemned provincial, out loud in front of your own men, was not a small thing to do. Mark tells us why he said it. Not because of the darkness, not because of the earthquake. Mark says it was because of how Jesus died. The centurion saw the manner of the death, and that was what convinced him. That is worth sitting with. A professional executioner had seen many men die. He knew what it looked like when a body finally failed. Something about this one did not match, and he said so in front of witnesses who could report him. Luke adds one more line about the crowd. He says that all the people who had gathered to watch went home beating their breasts. That was a gesture of grief and of guilt. The same crowd that had come out for a spectacle went back through the gates in mourning. These are small human details, and they are easy to skip. But they are the kind of thing that makes a text feel like reporting rather than legend. Nobody inventing a hero story puts the confession in the mouth of the enemy officer and the grief in the crowd that jeered. There were still soldiers on that hill with a job to finish. And what they did next produced the one detail that people who study this account keep coming back to. There was a deadline. The next day was the Sabbath, and not an ordinary one because it fell in Passover week. Bodies could not be left hanging into it. Jewish law was explicit about that, and the leaders went to Pilate to ask that the executions be finished quickly. The Roman method for finishing it was to break the legs. It sounds gratuitous, and it was brutal, but it had a purpose. A crucified man pushed up on his legs to breathe. take the legs away, and he could no longer lift himself, and it was over quickly. So they broke the legs of the two men crucified alongside him. Then they came to Jesus, and John, who says he was standing there, writes that they found he was already dead, and so they did not break his legs. Instead, one of the soldiers put a spear into his side. John says that blood and water came out. He then does something unusual for him. He breaks off the narrative to insist he saw it himself, and that he is telling the truth. That detail about blood and water has been examined by doctors for a long time. The usual explanation is fluid that collects around the heart and lungs under that kind of prolonged strain, separating into layers. If that is right, it is a detail a first-century writer would have no reason to invent. It also settles a question people raise. There is an old idea that Jesus did not actually die and revived later in the tomb. The men doing this were professionals with a legal obligation, and they checked. Their own lives depended on getting it right. John then points at two older passages. One says that not one of his bones would be broken, which was the rule for the Passover lamb. The other says they will look on the one they have pierced. He puts them side by side and lets the reader do the arithmetic. It is easy to read past how deliberate that is. The lamb whose bones were not to be broken was killed at that same festival, in that same city, on that same afternoon, a third of a mile away. John does not spell it out. He assumes his reader already knows. Whatever a person concludes about all of it, the structure of the account is tight. The timing lines up, the details line up, and they were written down while people who had been in that city could still contradict them. By now the light was almost gone, and there was still a body on a cross with a Sabbath coming, which raises a practical question the Gospels answer in an unexpected way. Who was going to take him down? Under Roman practice, the body of an executed criminal was not the family's to claim. It was disposed of by the state, often in a common grave. That was part of the punishment, and it was meant to be. So somebody had to ask. And the man who did was Joseph of Arimathea. All four Gospels name him, which by itself is notable. He was a wealthy member of the ruling council, the same council that had condemned Jesus that morning. Mark says he went boldly to Pilate. That word is doing a lot of work. He was asking a Roman governor for the body of a man just executed for claiming to be a king. He was doing it publicly. And he was a member of the body that had handed him over. There was no upside to this. He was giving up his standing in the council, his reputation, possibly more. And he did it for a man who was already dead, at the point where there was nothing left to gain. Mark records Pilate's reaction, and it is one of those small details that make the account feel like a record. Pilate was surprised that he was already dead. He sent for the centurion to confirm it before he would release the body. That is a strange thing to invent. It slows the story down, and it makes the Roman governor look careful rather than cruel. It reads like something that happened, reported by someone who found it worth reporting. Joseph did not act alone. John says Nicodemus came with him. This was the same Nicodemus who, earlier in that gospel, had come to see Jesus at night because he did not want to be seen doing it in daylight. And now, in the open, in front of the council and the Romans, he was helping carry a body. The man who came at night was doing this in front of everyone. John records what Nicodemus brought. About 75 pounds of myrrh and aloes. That is not a symbolic gesture. That quantity was a royal burial, the kind used for a king, and it would have cost a fortune. So two frightened men, both with everything to lose, buried an executed criminal like a king, in a hurry, before sundown. And the tomb they used was not a public grave. It was a new one, cut for somebody who could afford it. Which is exactly why what happened next mattered so much. The tomb belonged to Joseph. Matthew says it was his own, newly cut out of the rock, and that no one had ever been laid in it. That detail is not decoration. It closes off an obvious objection before anyone can raise it. Because if the tomb had held other bodies, every later argument about it being empty would have somewhere to go. A mix-up, a wrong tomb, another occupant. Matthew removes all of that in half a sentence. And he does it in passing. They worked fast. Sundown was coming, and with it the Sabbath, when the work would have to stop. John says they wrapped the body in linen with the spices, which was the Jewish custom, and laid it in the tomb because it was close by. Then they closed it. The tombs of that period were sealed with a large disc of stone that ran in a carved channel across the entrance. Rolling one into place went downhill and took a couple of men. Rolling one back took considerably more. Luke adds a line that is easy to miss. The women who had come with him from Galilee followed, and saw the tomb, and saw how his body was laid in it. They watched. They noted the place. That detail is doing work as well. All four Gospels put women at the burial and then at the tomb afterwards. In that culture, women were not treated as strong witnesses in a legal setting. Nobody constructing a case would build it on testimony their own society discounted. Then the Sabbath began, and everything stopped. Nobody could work. Nobody could travel far. Whatever the followers of Jesus were feeling that Friday night, they had a full day ahead in which they were not permitted to do anything about it. The Gospels say very little about that Saturday. It is the quietest day in the whole account. A group of people sat in a borrowed room in a city that had just executed their teacher, with a day of enforced stillness in front of them. It is worth noticing that the writers left that gap in rather than filling it. A story built for effect would put something in that space. The Gospels leave a whole day nearly blank because, as far as they knew, nothing happened in it. But something had happened on the Friday evening that almost nobody talks about. While those men sat in that room, a delegation was going back to Pilate, and what they asked him for tells you exactly what they were afraid of. Matthew is the one who records it. The chief priests and the Pharisees went to Pilate on the day after the execution. They reminded him that while Jesus was alive, he had said he would rise after 3 days. Stop on that. His enemies remembered the claim. They had heard it, taken it seriously enough to bring it up, and understood exactly what it would mean if anything happened that let people believe it. So they asked for the tomb to be made secure until the 3rd day. Their stated worry was that the disciples would come at night, take the body, and then tell people he had risen. Pilate gave them a guard and told them to make it as secure as they knew how. They sealed the stone and set the watch. The sealing was not a lock, it was a cord and an official seal across the join, so that anyone who moved the stone would break it, and everyone would know. Tampering with it was a serious offense. Look at the situation this creates. The tomb is new and has never held another body. Its location was watched by named people. It is sealed under official authority, and it is guarded by soldiers whose own necks were on the line. Whatever anyone concludes about what happened on the Sunday, the arrangements made on the Saturday were designed by people who wanted to rule out exactly one outcome, and they were made by the side that had every reason to get it right. There is a detail in this that people miss. By going to Pilate, the leaders put the claim on the official record. Before anything happened at all, a Roman governor had been formally told that this man had predicted he would rise. And Matthew does something bold with this passage. He is writing to an audience that includes people who lived through it. He records the guard, the seal, and later the explanation the authorities gave afterwards. He puts the counter-argument into his own book. Writers protecting a weak story do not do that. They leave the awkward part out. Matthew names the objection, tells you who was making it, and lets it stand there in his text next to his own account. So that is the Friday and the Saturday. A curtain torn from the top, ground split open, tombs broken, a Roman officer saying the unsayable, a rich councillor throwing away his position, a sealed stone, and a posted guard. All of it recorded in a few short paragraphs that most people have never had walked through. Step back from the events for a moment and look at the documents themselves, because this is where people usually have questions and rarely get answered. The 4 Gospels were written within a few decades of the events, not centuries, decades. Most scholars, across a wide range of beliefs, put them inside the 1st century, and Paul's letters, which mention the resurrection, are earlier still. Paul quotes something older than his own letter. He hands on a summary of the death, the burial, and the resurrection, and says he received it. Scholars generally treat that block as a fixed formula already in use, which puts it very close to the events themselves. He also does something risky in that same passage. He lists people who saw it, says most of them are still alive, and effectively tells his readers to go and ask them. That is not the move of a man who expects nobody to check. The accounts also disagree with each other on small things. How many women came to the tomb? What exact words were said? Where people were standing? Those differences get raised as a problem, and they are actually the opposite. Coordinated testimony is what you get when accounts are harmonized after the fact. Independent witnesses to the same event never match on the small details, and investigators expect that. What matters is whether they agree on the core, and on the core these four do. And then there is the awkward material. The disciples come off badly. They misunderstand, they argue about rank, they run away, and the leader of them denies knowing Jesus 3 times in one night. These men were the leaders of the movement that produced these books. Nobody writes their own founders that way without a reason. Ancient biographies flattered their subjects. These do not. The embarrassing material stayed in, which is generally taken as a sign that it was too well known to remove. None of this settles the question of what happened. It is not meant to. It settles a smaller question, which is whether these are late legends assembled by people far from the events. On that, the evidence is fairly clear, and it points the other way. So what do you do with a torn curtain, a split hillside, open tombs, and a Roman officer who changed his mind? The gospel writers do not tell you. They set it all down and then they stop. Which brings us to the part they clearly considered the point of the whole thing. Go back to the curtain because everything else hangs off it. For centuries that cloth had marked a boundary. On one side, ordinary space. On the other, the room where God's presence was understood to be, and where almost nobody was permitted to go. The system around it was elaborate. Sacrifices had to be made. The high priest had to be prepared. There was a day set aside for it once a year and a strict order to follow. The whole arrangement said plainly that access was limited and conditional. Then the cloth tore from the top down, and the arrangement was over. That is what the early Christians understood had happened. Not that the temple had been damaged, that the barrier had been removed, and removed from the far side, by someone the crowd could not see. It reframes the crucifixion in a way people often miss. Read one way, it is an execution that went wrong for everyone involved. Read the way the writers read it. It is the moment the door was opened, and the tear in the curtain is the receipt. That is why the letter to the Hebrews spends so long on the subject. It says the way into the holy place has been opened, and it calls it a new and living way. The writer is not proposing an idea, he is describing something he considers already done, and it explains a change that would otherwise be very strange. The earliest Christians were Jews, devout ones. Yet within a generation they had stopped bringing sacrifices, and they said so openly in a city where the temple was still standing and still operating. Whatever caused that, it was not gradual drift. Something happened that convinced people raised inside that system that the system had been completed, and they dated it to a specific Friday afternoon. The darkness fits the same pattern. Read it as weather, and it is an odd coincidence of timing. Read it the way the prophets wrote about the day of the Lord, with the sun going dark at noon, and it is a quotation. The earthquake fits too. So does the timing against the Passover lambs. So does the detail about the bones. Individually, each one can be explained away. Together they form a pattern that the writers clearly expected their readers to notice, which raises the obvious question, and it is the one the gospel writers were driving at the whole time. If that afternoon was what they say it was, then it was not the end of the account. It was the middle of it. Here is the timing laid out plainly, because it is the part that lands hardest when you see it all at once. Passover lambs were killed at the temple in the afternoon of that day. Thousands of them. The work was organized, timed, and it fell in the same window as the execution on the hill outside the wall. The lamb's bones were not to be broken. That was the instruction, set down centuries earlier for that specific meal. On the hill, the soldiers broke the legs of 2 men, and stopped at the third because he was already dead. John wrote his account decades later for readers who had grown up with that festival. He did not need to explain the connection. He simply placed the 2 facts next to each other and trusted his reader. There is another piece. The daily evening sacrifice at the temple fell at the 9th hour, 3 in the afternoon, the same hour in the same city that Jesus cried out and died. So at the hour the daily sacrifice was made, behind the curtain, in the building at the center of the nation, the curtain itself came apart. And the writers set that down in one plain sentence and moved on to the earthquake. You can take that as design or as coincidence. What you cannot easily do is call it a later invention, because the festival timings were public, fixed, and known to everyone reading. Nobody could have quietly moved them to fit a story. And this is the pattern all the way through the passage. The writers do not argue. They report the time, the place, the weather, the officer's name and rank, the councillor's hometown, the weight of the spices. Then they leave it there. It is a strange way to write propaganda, Propaganda tells you what to feel. This tells you what was measured, who was standing there, and what time it was. And then it stops talking, which leaves the reader to do something with it. And that, from the beginning, seems to have been the intention. So that is the hour. Not the whole story, and not the part most people are told, but the part the writers thought worth recording in detail while there were still people alive who had been there. A curtain 60 feet high, split from the top, in front of working priests. Ground opened and rock split. Tombs broken. A Roman officer who had done this work many times saying the one sentence that could cost him everything. A rich member of the council walking into a Roman palace to ask for the body of a condemned man. A frightened teacher carrying 75 pounds of burial spice up a hill in the open. Women standing where they could see and noting the place. And then a sealed stone, an official cord, and a posted guard, arranged by men who had listened carefully to what he said he would do and wanted to make certain it could not appear to happen. None of that is hidden. It is all sitting in 4 short accounts that anybody can read in an afternoon. It is simply not what gets preached, because the preaching usually moves from the death straight to the Sunday and leaves the hour in between alone. That is the gap this channel exists for. Not new doctrine, not secret books, just the parts of the text that are already there and already public, walked through slowly enough to actually see them. If a single detail carried this much, and it sat unread in half a verse, the honest question is, what else is sitting there? The Book of Judges has a left-handed man nobody teaches. The Book of Acts has a chapter about priests changing sides. There is a great deal of it, so that is where we go next. One overlooked passage at a time, told properly, with the details left in. The people who wrote these accounts were not trying to overwhelm anyone. They wrote down the time, the place, and what they saw, and left it for whoever came next to weigh. 2,000 years later, that is still the offer. Read it slowly. Notice what is actually there. And if this is the kind of thing you want more of, subscribe, and I will keep pulling these out of the parts that get skipped.